Welcome to the Empowered Christian Woman Podcast. My name is Jeanette Cochran. I'm a pastor, women's leadership coach, and self-proclaimed Jesus feminist. I'm on a mission to inspire and equip women everywhere to own our voice, speak up, create, and lead wherever God calls. Because when women rise, everyone wins. Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. How you doing? I hope you're doing well. I know it's been a minute since I have recorded an episode, but I am back and I'm excited to bring another important conversation today. Today I have a conversation with a fantastic ministry leader. Her name is Sally Hope, and Sally shares her personal journey of leaving an abusive marriage and the challenges faced by Christian women in abusive situations and the need for better support from the church. Here in the U.S., 1 in 5 women have experienced abuse from an intimate partner. And sadly, the statistics are no different for Christian marriages. Sally is the creator of an 11-week recovery initiative designed to help women healing from domestic abuse, and she's the author of a new book called 30 Steps to Finding Yourself, which is designed really for all women in all walks of life. As women, we're socially conditioned to build our lives and our identities around other people, around our relationships of wife or mother or daughter. And I think this can often be even more of an issue for Christian women because we're taught biblical lessons like we should serve and put ourselves last and die to self, which are all messages in the Bible, but oftentimes these messages are taken out of context and they're distorted and they just leave Christian women confused. They leave us wondering who we really are, what makes me, me, what makes me unique. And so in this insightful conversation with Sally, she talks a little bit about that and really delves into the importance of developing our identity in Christ and what that means, and some thoughts about how we can do that and how we can have a healthy self-esteem and really lean into who God has created us to be. So this is what I think is really an insightful conversation that can really help all women. So I'm glad you're here today. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Sally Hope. Welcome, Sally, to the podcast. I'm grateful to have you here and to be sharing what I think is really going to be a very important conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So my name is Sally Hope, and I am based in the UK, and I work with survivors of domestic abuse with a specific focus on Christian survivors. I'm also the author of a book called 30 Steps to Finding Yourself, which is aimed at any woman, not just survivors of domestic abuse, not just Christian women, all women. But obviously, because it's written by me, it's written from my faith perspective, and it's written with the background of understanding how trauma affects women. My main area of work is my Always Hopeful program, which is a 11-week recovery program for Christian women who have experienced domestic abuse. The idea is that churches can run this program locally, but it is also run online, and survivors can join the program free of charge and just kind of work through all those questions that experiencing domestic abuse as a Christian raises for us. Like, why did God let this happen to me? And doesn't God hate me if I get divorced? And all those, all those questions that come up for women who experience abuse. Should I submit to this abuse? Is a common one.
So tell us a little bit about your story. How did you develop this passion for helping women recognize and recover from abuse?
Like a lot of people, it's personal experience that has caused me to develop a passion. So in 2013, I left an abusive marriage We'd been married for 13 and a half years. We'd been together for 16 years. And, it was mostly my faith that kept me in that marriage. And when I left my husband, my prevailing feeling was anger at God that he'd allowed me to be abused. But, you can't stay angry at God for long. He doesn't let you. I decided I wasn't talking to God, and I wasn't going to church, and I wasn't going to read my Bible, and I wasn't going to pray, and that was it. We were done. But, God's always kind of like, hello, what are you doing? Can we have a chat? I was, God wasn't letting that happen. And God, really gently held me and healed me. It says in Psalm that he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And that was my experience. You read these passages in the Bible, and suddenly when you experience them, you really have a sense of what they really mean. So, as I recovered from abuse, I kind of started researching and trying to understand it in light of my faith. And I felt that nobody was there for me. I was all alone because the church didn't understand domestic abuse, and they weren't helpful. And they said really, really unhelpful things to me. Like, have you prayed for forgiveness for your part in the abuse? And things like that, which were really, really not what I needed to hear. And they encouraged me to drop the charges as well, which is something I regret. But you can't live with regrets, can you? So the church, I think they tried, but they just didn't get it. And then the secular support agencies that were helping me around the domestic abuse didn't understand my faith. And I think a lot of them blamed my faith and saw Christianity as something that's very patriarchal and, keeps women trapped in horrible abusive marriages, which it can be, but it shouldn't be. So I kind of felt very alone, and I journeyed through that healing process, mostly on my own, obviously with God, but not with anyone else, any other human being to talk to about what I was going through. And as I did so, I learned that Christian women experience domestic abuse at the same rates as every other woman. There's no protective factor in faith that protects you from domestic abuse. And that made me, and it still makes me, really, really cross, because we're supposed to be different. We're supposed to be a light to the world. And yet 25% of women in our churches are being abused by their husbands. Beside the fact that it's absolutely unacceptable, it's also a dreadful witness. So I just became really keen to change that and make a difference. So I started by volunteering in a women's refuge, and eventually I got a job there, and they trained me, and I specialised in recovery groups. So I ran recovery groups for women who had experienced domestic abuse. And of course, it was a secular organisation because there isn't anything like that in the church. But the more I learned, the more I wanted to create something that was. So eventually, after lots and lots of years working, I pulled together this domestic abuse program, Always Hopeful, which kind of draws on some of the stuff that I learned whilst working in domestic abuse. Also draws on my own experiences of reconciling my faith with my experience. And I have got a degree in religious studies, so I had some of the knowledge to kind of bring the theology into it a little bit, although I'm not a theologian and I'm not an expert. And it's not about the theology. It's about giving women a space to work out their own understanding of their own theology and their own what they've experienced.
Wow.
Hope that made sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's so needed. And it's interesting. You talk about initially feeling like you needed to let go of your faith altogether, particularly I think for women that are experiencing abuse in faith communities where they have been taught patriarchal teachings or what is often called complementarianism. which I will still stand by, is just a nicer form of patriarchy, but it's still
Oh,
patriarchy.
spiritualized
Right.
patriarchy.
Exactly. They just,
Yeah.
they just kind of dress it up a little bit because, to your point, when we are stuck in abusive relationships and we realize we've stayed there and we've done all the things that we were taught God wanted us to do, and it didn't change anything. And most of the time when I speak with women who have experienced abuse, all they wanted was to save their marriage and have a healthy marriage, but it was beyond them because they didn't have complete control. It takes two people. And so I think that is the natural expression. It's like, well, then it didn't work. Everything I was told didn't work. So where was God? We need different teaching. We need to expose that for what it is, because I think at the core of abuse is a desire for control.
So a system that hands that control to men perpetuates
It
abuse.
perpetuates it. Yeah.
Yeah. Not every complementarian man will be abusive, but
Right.
a man that is abusive is going to find support within that system and is going to be emboldened and empowered by that system. And women are disempowered. So, there's no condemnation. There's no explicit condemnation of abuse.
Yes.
My ex-husband used to make us sit down and watch YouTube videos and listen to podcasts from complementarian preachers. And that kept me in my place. That stopped me having the knowledge and the power to leave, even though that wasn't the tradition that I was brought up in. I'm a Methodist. I was brought up that women and men were equal. They had an equal role. There was no head of the household in the household I grew up in. It was fairly traditional because my dad was a man from the 1950s, but he didn't. He wasn't the head in real terms. My mum was just as much the head of the household. My sister wanted to be a minister for a long time, and I saw women preachers, but then my husband just it's insidious, and it crept in. He wouldn't let us go to a church where there were women preachers, and I was kind of diverted so that was the only way I could see my faith in the end. And it's quite telling about what domestic abuse does to your brain, because as I said, I had a degree in religious studies. I'd been a Christian since childhood. I'm intelligent, I'm educated, I'm quite strong, quite tough. And yet I wasn't able to think for myself when I was in that situation because he had complete control over me.
That's so important to say, because I think oftentimes I hear from women, once they get out, they realize that they felt shame. And so part of the speaking up and getting help sometimes is feeling like, well, I should be smarter than this. Why did this happen to me? So I think that's so important that you point out that it happens to smart, very strong women, and it doesn't mean that you're inferior. And there's a system that it can be set up against us. It takes something sometimes traumatic or an awakening to realize what's happening to us, especially in the religious circles that teach complementarian theology and patriarchy. I love the work that you're doing, and I think it's so important because people mistakenly think that complementarian teachings are not harmful, and they don't realize that maybe it's not harming you, but they do harm women and they harm marriages and they perpetuate abuse. So it's not just about giving a woman a voice in the church, which I think is really important, and giving her a voice. It's also about ensuring that our marriages are healthy and that they are flourishing in the way that God designed them to be, two interdependent people bringing their whole self. I'm so glad that you found a way back to your faith and to decide to be able to take that and make a difference with it.
So you just mentioned that, in a marriage, it's two people taking their whole selves into a marriage. And in abusive situations, you don't take your whole self into the marriage. Your self gets eroded and you just become a mirror of your abuser. My husband had a nickname, and my name was Mrs. and then his nickname. I didn't even have my first name. Everything about me, everything about who I was built around him. So when he left, I just didn't know who I was anymore, because if I wasn't his wife, then who was I? And something that I've learned over the last decade is that this is not something that is unique to women that have experienced domestic abuse. I've met lots of women who just are not in great relationships and they want to leave, but they're kind of frightened, like, well, who will I be if I'm not that man's girlfriend? And how will I cope on my own? Because they've poured everything about themselves into that relationship. They don't know who they are anymore. And not just romantic relationships. I meet lots of women in their 50s whose children have grown up and moved out. And suddenly, my kids don't need me anymore. I'm not mum. Who am I? So, I think as women, society encourages us to focus on everybody else, to please everybody else, to shape ourselves into mold ourselves into likable shapes so that everybody likes us. And in doing that, again, we lose ourselves. And lots of women can hit a point in their life where they kind of go, oh, who am I? Maybe we call this midlife crisis. But wouldn't it be better to head that off so that we don't have the midlife crisis? And not only that, but having a strong sense of yourself is actually a protective factor against domestic abuse. So it can make you more resilient and it can make it easier to heal from domestic abuse when if you do experience it. It can also make it easier for you to put boundaries in place and spot the abuse so that you can protect yourself from abuse in the first place. So when I was working in the Women's Refuge, running groups to help women recover from domestic abuse, I found that lots and lots of the women that I was working with didn't want to come to my groups because they didn't want to talk about domestic abuse. They said, I've had enough of it. I've been dealing with it for all those years. I just don't want to think about it. And sometimes it was because they weren't ready yet. But other times it was that I had women who'd been to all my groups. They were at the end of their journey. They didn't want to talk about domestic abuse anymore, but they still wanted something. So I decided it would be really great to create a group that would serve both of those women at both ends of the journey. So the women who were not ready to talk about domestic abuse and the women who were almost done. They'd been through it all. They'd done lots of work on their recovery because those women were such great support to each other. The women who were kind of near the end of the journey, it was so empowering for them to support the women who had just escaped. So I really wanted a group that brought those two groups together. And the most common thing that I heard from women who had experienced domestic abuse was, I just don't know who I am anymore. So I created a 6-week group program that was all around identity and finding yourself and working out who you are outside of your relationships and outside of the stereotypes that we're given by society. And importantly, not just who are you, but can you take control of who you are? Can you mold yourself into what you want to be? Can you say, do you know what? I'm maybe not very naturally thoughtful, but I'd like to be. Can I develop that and make that a part of my personality? So it was a 6-week program, and we spent the first half of each session talking about that kind of thing. And then the second half I made into a really lovely sort of, I want to say craft time, but we didn't just do crafts. We spent time looking for our inner child. So sometimes we played Lego. Sometimes we did gluing and sticking and used lots of glitter, or we made chocolate cornflake cakes. All those things that you do as a child that you stop doing as an adult, maybe because you're not very good at it. And as an adult, when it comes to things like crafts, it's all about, am I any good at it? And what does it look like? So I made it about the journey and about the experience, not about the finished result. So we spent just a good hour just playing. And that's so good for the soul. And if you think about it, your inner child, that's you. Because when we're children, we haven't learnt to hide who we are. If you want to meet someone who's most authentically themselves, go and find a 4-year-old. They do not hide anything about themselves. 4-year-olds are just out there. They've not learned to yet. So, if you connect with your inner child, it's a good way to find yourself. So we had this group going. It was brilliant. It was really, really great. Women were getting so much out of it. And then along came COVID. And suddenly we couldn't meet in groups anymore. And all the women in the refuge had to stay in their rooms. And they had a rota for when they could use the kitchen so that they weren't in it with other people. And it was just horrible. So I took that group and I turned it into a daily journal. So each day they could be given something that they could do on their own in their rooms. So using the same material from the group. And it was kind of like a 6-week, because it was a 6-week program each day. So what would have been a session, I broke down into 5 days. So I ended up with a book that was 6 chapters long with 5 steps in each chapter, so 30 steps. And I just thought, do you know what? This is what I've been thinking all these years that women need, that all women need, not just domestic abuse victims. Every woman needs to be able to work out who she is. So I sort of took that and turned it into this really lovely journal that any woman can follow. So you get 30 steps. So you can take a step a day, or, you can do it at your own pace. You can do it at whatever works for you. And each step has a little bit of information, something to think about with some journaling pages, and then something nice to do. Some of those nice activities for finding your inner child that I was doing with women in the afternoon. And that's how that came about.
So creative and interesting how even in the midst of the difficulty of COVID, you decided to innovate, and now your work is being shared with people around the world. I am so with you on the need for us as women to really get a solid self of identity of who we are, even beyond the roles, because so often we identify ourselves with our roles, and we are more than daughter, wife, mother, even pastor, because our roles change and our life changes. And so if we don't have that deeply rooted, then we do find that place where we wake up and we're like, I'm not sure who I am and what to do with my life. For me as a pastor, I took a break from ministry for about 18 months, and it was the best thing that I ever did, because suddenly I was not, quote unquote, a pastor. I was not working as a pastor. Yes. It actually helped me to connect deeper with, I'm a daughter of God, and the gifts that God has given me that I express as a pastor, but those gifts are me. I'm not a role. So I can show up wherever I am and bring who I am. I hear oftentimes in Christian circles, people will say, oh, that's just selfish. We're called to sacrifice. And there's a lot of talk about finding yourself, but Jesus says you need to lose your life. And so just taking these scriptures out of context. And so what would you say to women who are like, isn't that selfish to be thinking about what I want?
There's 2 facets here. So the first one is the whole aspect of taking care of yourself when you should be putting others first. And then the other is knowing who you are. So in terms of the first one, the self-care aspect of things, we've got a lovely session in the Always Hopeful program about this. And we talk about the difference between self-esteem and humility. So the Bible calls us to be humble. And humility is understanding your right place in the world, but also understanding other people's. So self-esteem, to have positive self-esteem, tells me I am a beloved daughter of God. I am valuable. I'm worthy. I'm loved. God looks at me and delights over me with singing. Thinks I am his masterpiece. So that's self-esteem. Humility is recognizing that so is everybody else. I'm not better than everybody else. So the 2 are not opposites. That you can be humble and have good self-esteem. So, you can look after yourself and look after others. And in fact, if you don't look after yourself, you're not going to do a great job of looking after others, are you? So if you think about, when you're on the aeroplane and you get the safety briefing, and it tells you that when the oxygen masks come down, put your own mask on, before you put your children's mask on. And that's really counterintuitive to mums, isn't it? But there's a reason for that. And the reason is that if you're unconscious on the floor, passed out because you haven't got your oxygen, you can't put your child's mask on. So if we want to serve others and we want to be good servants of God, we need to take care of ourselves so that we can. So that's that aspect of it. Now, the other aspect is the finding yourself, and I've had a few Christians comment on my Facebook page saying, well, I don't need to find myself because my identity is in Christ. And yeah, it is. And so is yours, and so is every other Christians in the world. But I'm not you. I'm different to you. And it's not about saying my identity is in anything other than Christ. Of course my identity is in Christ. I'm a Christian. But what is it that makes me Sally and you Jeanette? And, and again, we talk about this metaphor in the Always Hopeful program, but I always think about, how we're all made in the image of God. So I always think of a diamond. And the reason a diamond sparkles is because it's got lots and lots of facets. And God is like that diamond. And he is so glorious and so majestic and amazing and massive and huge that he requires every single human being to be different in order to reflect his glory. And if you think about the number of human beings from the beginning of time into eternity, that's a lot of human beings that are necessary. And every single person needs to reflect God in a different way. And we do that by being ourselves. And so, as Christians, as women in general, knowing who you are is really healthy. But for Christian women, we've got more obligation to do that because we're supposed to be reflecting God's glory. And we reflect God's glory by being the unique created person that we were made to be.
So it's essential to our faith if we're actually going to live out our calling to glorify God in the world. And Jesus clearly said we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if we are not loving ourselves, if we have self-hatred, or we've just rejected ourselves because instead we've taken on the identity and morphed ourselves into the person that we think others want, then that's not loving ourselves. So we can't, to your point, we can't show up. There's something that we have to do to receive who we are with God's grace and love who we are so that we can then show up and extend authentic love to others.
And the Bible is so full of analogy and metaphor about the human race being one flesh, or it calls us a body, doesn't it? It says we're one body. We are interconnected. And, even if we look at the culture when the Bible was written, people didn't think of themselves. They thought of themselves as part of a community. And again, that might be where criticism of looking for yourself comes from. But actually, when you're part of a community and you're interconnected, if you don't take care of yourself, it has a knock-on effect on those around you, doesn't it? So, if you don't take care of one part of the body, that's going to have a knock-on effect on the rest. If you don't take care of yourself, if your self-esteem is low, think about people that we know who hate themselves. Hard work, aren't they? They're emotionally draining. And so, it's a duty to everybody else. If we are going to look after other people, we need to look after ourselves because otherwise it has a knock-on effect on everybody else.
Self-care, it's a lot more than just taking a bubble bath and having some chocolate. I mean, it really is. It's a way of life and making sure that you're making time for yourself every day. And some of that is rooted in identity and starting to love ourselves and value ourselves and realize that we have a contribution to make to the world, to the people around us, and we need to be whole and healthy. Are there other things that come to mind that you see women grapple with that hold them back from really owning their identity and stepping, into the fullness of who God created them to be?
I think anything that we do, anything that we believe, anything that we, even things we enjoy can become a sort of a label that's attached to us, can't it? And then we can kind of become a pastiche of ourselves very easily. So, I'm 4'10.5", very tiny. And I've always grown up hearing, you're the short, bolshy one. You're the feisty one. You'll even see memes on social media about the short girl in the crowd is always the feisty one. And there's been times in my life that I've played into that stereotype. What if I'm not feisty? I am. Am I feisty because I'm short? Or why is that? And anything can become a label and a stereotype. And we can find ourselves playing into that. And some of what we have to look at is this positive? Is this a good thing? What's the effect of that on my life? And for women, a lot of it comes around being ladylike, doesn't it? All around sex, And what I find really interesting is that oftentimes the church thinks that it's very different to secular society in the way that it views women and sex and family. So, there's a lot of focus in regular society on getting a man. I used to read magazines as a teenage girl, magazines with sex tips in them for how to give the best blowjob, or how to be the best kisser, how to make a man happy, how to put your makeup on to make a man find you attractive. And as a Christian, I was like, oh, that's disgusting. We shouldn't be focusing our lives around making ourselves sexy for men. But if you look at Christian culture, it does the same thing. It's just flip side of the same coin. When we look at purity culture and we talk about being pure so that a man will still find you attractive, it's no different. We're still teaching our teenage girls to base everything they do and everything they are around finding a man. And whilst, secular culture might be all about hookups and we focus on family, it's still focusing our identity on relationships. And I think, family in church family and marriage has almost become idolized. It's very difficult to be a single woman within the church. And that's not good, because God made us all different. And some of us will have families and some of us won't. But if we put pressure on people to find a man and get married by the time they're 30, otherwise they're losers and they're spinsters and they're going to grow up to be like the crazy cat woman from The Simpsons who just throws cats around. That's when women stop being themselves and stop being able to be themselves.
Yeah. There is a lot of pressure on women in society in general, and you're right, especially in the church. You are valuable at married or not married, and you have a purpose. And hopefully our churches, the more we start to talk about this, will recognize and start to realize that they need to make sure that they're giving those messages. It's fine to value marriage, but we don't want to idolize marriage. Marriage it's a wonderful thing. It's not a woman's highest calling.
No, and neither's motherhood.
And we've heard that, right? This is your highest calling. So some women get it and some don't. And I disagree with that. It's a beautiful thing when it's healthy, but it's not our highest calling. It's not who we are.
And I'm a mom, and it's wonderful. And I love it, and I wouldn't change it for the world, but it's not everything that I am. And when I hear those messages, being a mother is a woman's highest calling and greatest privilege, I just feel for women who can't have children, and how must that feel to women who are unable to have children? It's horrible. And actually, our greatest calling is to reflect God.
Yes.
Is to be Jesus, is to love our neighbour. And, we can do that whatever our relationship status, whatever our career. We can be a stay-at-home mum, or we can be a career woman in the office, flying up the corporate ladder. We can still glorify God and we can still reflect God.
Jesus was pretty clear on that, wasn't he? The greatest commandment. And so It's so interesting how that's been ignored. And so many of us women have heard the phrase said, that our greatest calling is is to be a homemaker and a wife and a mother. And
It's like we're stuffed into that box, isn't it? And the lid's put tightly on. And how
the
dare we
box.
bulge out of it? Yeah.
Yes. Well, how can friends or family or even the church community, how can they support women who are recovering from domestic abuse and trying to rebuild their lives and identities?
Well, the church could support women by running my Always Hopeful program. So there's a plug from me. The great thing about the Always Hopeful program is you don't need training to run it, but the power of Zoom, I can train any church anywhere in the world to run the program. And I'm always telling people, you don't need to be an expert. You don't need to understand everything about domestic abuse. You don't have to have worked in that area. The key thing is to love. Are you prepared to love women who have experienced domestic abuse? If so, you can run it. You've got everything you need to run a program. So, that's one way. But, the other way is to talk about it. The biggest barrier for women is the silence and the stigma and the shame. So do we talk about it from the pulpit? Do we condemn domestic abuse? How many sermons do we hear about marriage? So do we ever mention domestic abuse in those sermons? So talk about it. Even simple acts like putting a poster on the inside of the women's toilet doors with the phone number for the local domestic abuse service so that women can get help. Simple things like that not only are practical and provide help, but they let women know that it happens and it's okay that it happens and the church is aware of it. As for neighbours, friends, love. Love, 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 love. I was listening to your February podcast with the woman who had written the book, Love Is. And it's on my reading list now. And I think, I've sort of come to the same conclusions that love is the answer to everything. There is no problem that exists that cannot be solved with love. So, if you go and take a look at 1 Corinthians 13, treat domestic abuse victims like that, and you're going to help them. Be kind, be patient, bear with them. How can you bear their burdens with them? How can you support them? How can you be enduring? All those kind of things. And again, it's about being positive. So domestic abuse victims are often told that they're rubbish and that they're worthless or that they have to stay. So think about the things that abusers say and counter those things. So, if you have a friend who's a domestic abuse victim, build her up. Build her up all the time. Tell her how great she is. Tell her how strong she is. Because that's what she needs to be able to move on.
Well, Sally, this has been great. You are such an inspiration and a role model. I'm so glad that you broke free from a marriage that was unhealthy and abusive. And I'm glad that the Lord didn't let go of you and eventually was able to bring you back to your faith so that you could connect the real gospel and the real truth of God's love and grace for all of us, because it is so needed in the church. And that even today, as we're listening, no doubt there are probably women listening that are Christian women in marriages where they're experiencing abuse, and maybe they're not even fully aware that that's what it is, or maybe they are. And so I hope that they will reach out to take a look at your resources, or maybe even there's someone listening that might decide to look at your program and start that at their church. So if people are interested in finding out more about you and your program, where would they go to find that information?
My website is alwayshopeful.org.uk. On there, I've got a blog. I've got a page headed Writing where you can read about my book and has links to places you can purchase my book, which is out now in the UK and will be out in the US and Canada from May. There's a page called What is Always Hopeful that tells you all about the Always Hopeful program. If you are a woman who would like to do the Always Hopeful program and there isn't one running at a church near you, It is run online, and it's run online by an organisation called Restored, who are a UK Christian charity. And they have an international community of survivors. So they run it via Zoom. I think they try and find a time that works across the world, and they have people joining from all over the world. As long as you're English speaking, I think that you can join it.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sally. This has been a wonderful conversation and so important. And thank you for being here, and thank you for your work.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Empowered Christian Woman Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and share it with other women in your network. For more information about me and the work that I do, check out JeanetteCochran.com. And I'd love to hear from you personally. Come join the conversation on social. You can find me on Facebook at J. Cochran Coach or Instagram at Jeanette.Cochran.